Okay, so are you ready to dive into this wild U.S. election?
Oh, absolutely. It's been a roller coaster so far.
8 days to go, and it's still anyone's game, right? Harris versus Trump neck and neck. It feels like the whole country is holding its breath.
It does, doesn't it? You know, it's interesting to see how this race is mirroring 2020, so divided.
Yeah. The tension is palpable. We've been digging through some great sources, articles from Al Jazeera, polls from CBS News, YouGov, 538.
All pointing to the same thing, a total nail-biter.
Exactly. The polls are so close, both nationally and in those swing states. It's crazy. Nationally, the latest CBS News YouGov poll has Harris at 50% and Trump at 49%.
That's unbelievable. One single percentage point separating them.
I know, but it's even wilder, that difference. It's actually within the margin of error.
Right. Statistically, they're basically tied.
Yeah.
And 538 shows the same thing. Harris slightly ahead nationally, but that gap is closing fast.
So we all know it's not just about the popular vote. It's about those electoral college votes, those swing states, right?
You got it. And it seems like 7 states could decide it all. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, North Carolina, Arizona, and Georgia.
That's a lot, riding on a handful of states.
And get this, 538 has all of them within just 2 points of each other.
It's insane. Every vote will count. And you know what Al Jazeera pointed out? Michigan's situation is particularly interesting this time around.
Oh, right, with the Arab American and Muslim population there.
Exactly. They could be a decisive voting bloc, especially with all the concerns about the Israel-Gaza war.
Yeah, right. It's a prime example of how what's happening globally directly impacts our elections here at home.
Totally. Domestic and foreign policy all tangled up. And speaking of voter trends, you know what else the CBS News YouGov poll found? There's a huge gender gap this time.
Yeah. More men leaning toward Trump, more women for Harris.
I wonder what's driving that. It's fascinating, right?
It is. The poll suggests that men see Trump as a stronger leader, and women believe Harris has, better mental and cognitive health to be president.
That's a really interesting point. It's not just policies, it's how voters perceive them. And on that note, have you noticed how different their campaign styles are?
Totally. They've taken very different approaches, especially in these final weeks.
It's like night and day. Harris is laser-focused on young voters, emphasizing how important it is for them to vote.
Yeah, smart strategy, considering they historically have lower voter turnout compared to older generations.
Right. She even called this election the most consequential election of our lifetime. No pressure, right?
And meanwhile, Trump is, Trump, sticking to his huge rallies, going on the offensive.
Like last weekend in New York City, that massive rally he held.
Where he really doubled down on immigration.
Yeah, his language was pretty strong, calling immigrants vicious and bloodthirsty criminals. Not exactly subtle.
Classic Trump, appealing to fear and anger, solidifying his base.
And speaking of not subtle, did you see his attacks on Harris at that rally?
Oh yeah, calling her a radical left Marxist, attacking her intelligence. It's all out attack mode.
But then there was that incident with the comedian at the rally. Remember that? The offensive joke about Puerto Rico.
Oh yeah, that was unexpected. Even the Trump campaign had to distance themselves from that one.
I know, right? It just goes to show how every little thing is scrutinized in a race this tight.
Absolutely. Every word, every action can have an impact. Speaking of surprises, I was shocked by that Arab News YouGov poll. Did you see it?
The one showing Trump with slightly more support among Arab Americans than Harris?
Yeah, I mean, who would have predicted that?
It seems counterintuitive, right? Especially considering his past rhetoric.
I know. But according to Al Jazeera, a lot of Muslim Americans are disillusioned with how the Biden administration has handled the conflict in Gaza.
Interesting. So they may not agree with everything Trump stands for, but they see him as potentially more effective in that specific area.
That's what it seems like. And remember, this is a key demographic in Michigan, that swing state we were talking about.
It's amazing how all these threads are intertwining: the polls, global events, the campaign strategies it's making for such an unpredictable race.
It truly is. And with only 8 days left, I'm on the edge of my feet to see what happens next. Where do we go from here?
Let's delve into what each candidate is doing in this final week before the election to secure those crucial votes.
All right, let's see how they're planning to close this out. Well, let's start with Harris. She's making a beeline for Michigan.
Right back to that crucial swing state.
Yeah, and remember, it has that large Arab American population we were just talking about.
Right, with those potential voters being swayed by the situation in Gaza.
Exactly, so she's holding a rally there this week with her running mate, Tim Walz.
Okay, standard campaign stuff.
Yeah, but get this, they're also doing a concert.
A concert? Really? That's a new one.
Seems like they're pulling out all the stops to attract those younger voters.
Smart move. I bet it's going to be a huge draw.
Oh, yeah. And they've got Maggie Rogers performing.
Oh, wow. She's really popular right now.
Definitely a good choice to energize that younger demographic and get them excited about voting.
It's like they're trying to create a whole cultural moment around the campaign.
Totally tap into the power of music.
So while Harris is rocking out in Michigan, what's Trump up to?
Trump's taking a more traditional approach.
Okay, back to basics.
Yeah, he's addressing a national faith summit this week.
I bet that's going to be interesting.
He's likely trying to solidify his support among those evangelical voters.
Makes sense. They're a key demographic for him.
And then he's holding another rally in Georgia.
Another one of those must-win states.
Exactly. So it seems like Harris is trying to broaden her appeal while Trump's doubling down on his base.
Two very different strategies. Let's see what happens.
Here you go. And don't forget about early voting.
Oh, right over 41 million Americans have already voted.
That's a pretty significant number.
It is, although it's less than the over 100 million early votes we saw in 2020.
Yeah, that difference is probably because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Makes sense. Back then, there was a huge push for mail-in and early voting.
Exactly, to avoid those big crowds and minimize potential exposure.
And now with the pandemic mostly behind us, people are going back to those more traditional voting patterns.
You got it. But it's important to remember that those early votes don't necessarily reveal who's going to win.
Right. We have to wait until election day to see who everyone else votes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's dive into some of the issues that are really shaping this election.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start?
Well, the situation in Gaza is definitely top of mind for a lot of voters.
Yeah, it feels like that's become a major factor in this race.
It's a huge foreign policy challenge, and it's playing out in a very interesting way in our domestic politics.
You know, it's funny you should mention that because I was thinking about that Arab News YouGov poll we discussed earlier.
The one with Trump having slightly more support among Arab Americans than Harris?
Yeah, I mean, I still can't wrap my head around that.
It is surprising. But, Al Jazeera's reporting suggests that a lot of Muslim Americans are unhappy with how the Biden administration has been handling the conflict.
So they're looking for an alternative.
It seems that way. Some feel that Trump, despite his past, might actually be more likely to make progress in the region.
So it's not necessarily about agreeing with everything he says. It's about a perceived lack of options.
Right, a sense of disillusionment with the status quo.
It just goes to show that voters are complex and their motivations can be influenced by so many different factors.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to understand the nuances within those demographic groups.
You can't just look at those broad categories. You have to delve deeper.
Exactly. You have to understand those specific concerns and priorities and how they relate to their lived experiences.
Well said. And speaking of issues that resonate with specific groups, what about immigration?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Trump really went all in on that at his New York rally.
He did remember his rhetoric about immigrants being vicious and bloodthirsty criminals.
Yeah, that was pretty intense.
Definitely designed to appeal to those who see immigration as a threat.
Fear-mongering at its finest.
Unfortunately, it's a tactic that's worked for him before.
It has, but it's also incredibly divisive and, frankly, pretty harmful.
It's the opposite of Harris's approach, which has been to advocate for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants.
It's a classic example of those clashing ideologies.
One side appealing to fear, the other to compassion.
Right. But it's important to remember that there are varying views on immigration, even within the Republican Party.
You're absolutely right. Not all Republicans support that hardline stance.
Some are pushing for more moderate approaches to immigration reform.
It's always more nuanced than those polarized narratives might suggest.
Okay, so we've talked about Gaza and immigration. What about healthcare?
Another crucial issue, especially this year with Obamacare back in the spotlight.
Yeah, it feels like that debate never really goes away.
It doesn't. And Trump is still vowing to repeal and replace it, even though he's never actually laid out a clear alternative plan.
Which has drawn criticism even from some Republicans.
They feel like it's not responsible to promise repeal without a viable replacement.
Makes sense. And on the other side, Harris is positioning herself as a defender of the ACA.
Pledging to build upon it and expand access to affordable health care.
So it's a pretty clear contrast in approaches.
It is dismantle versus strengthen and expand.
And of course, we can't talk about healthcare without talking about COVID-19.
Right. The pandemic really shook things up and highlighted the vulnerabilities of our system.
And brought those bigger questions about access, affordability, and the role of government to the forefront.
Absolutely. It's reshaped the whole conversation.
Okay, so healthcare is a big one. What about the economy?
Always a crucial factor in any presidential election.
It's what everyone's talking about.
And as usual, both candidates are painting very different pictures of the current economic landscape.
Trying to spin it to their advantage.
Exactly. Trump is harking back to the pre-pandemic days under his watch.
The good old days.
Right, claiming credit for that booming economy and blaming the current situation on Biden.
The classic tactic.
Meanwhile, Harris is focusing on the progress made under Biden.
Highlighting the positive aspects, despite the challenges.
Yeah, emphasizing job growth and economic recovery.
So it's a battle of narratives, two competing stories.
And it's up to the voters to decide which one they buy into.
Okay, so we've got the economy. What about those social issues that are really driving a lot of the passion this election? You know, it's amazing. This whole election feels like a giant mirror reflecting all of America's anxieties right
Oh,
now.
absolutely. We've got those big ideological clashes, the economy, healthcare, social justice. Then you throw in the whole social media whirlwind.
And don't forget about the global context. Everything feels so uncertain.
Yeah, it's like the world is holding its breath, too. It really makes you think about the future.
And speaking of the future, one of the most striking things I've noticed is that generational divide.
Oh, totally. Younger voters are all in on Harris, it seems.
While older voters are sticking with Trump,
Two totally different outlooks, different priorities. It's fascinating.
I know younger voters are fired up about climate change, social justice, gun control.
And older voters are more concerned with the economy, national security, those more traditional values.
Makes you wonder what this means for politics down the road, you know?
Will this gap widen, or will we figure out a way to bridge it? Find some common ground. It's a big question.
It is, and speaking of big moments, those upcoming debates could really shake things up.
Oh, for sure they're a game changer. Voters get to see the candidates side by side, unscripted, under pressure.
It's like a political pressure cooker. They have to articulate their vision, address concerns, show their leadership chops.
But debates can be unpredictable too.
Totally. One wrong move, one awkward moment, and it could swing the whole race.
The pressure is on for both of them. They need to be knowledgeable, experienced, connect with voters on a gut level. It's a high wire act.
And we can't forget about the global stage. This election isn't happening in a bubble.
You're right. The international scene is a total whirlwind right now. The war in Gaza, tensions with China, it's a lot.
It all feels so interconnected, doesn't it? What happens on one side of the world ripples out everywhere.
Definitely. And the next president, whoever they are, will have to handle all of it. They'll need to be a leader for America and for a world that's facing some really tough challenges.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible.
We've covered so much.
So much. And it feels like we've just scratched the surface. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. What's standing out to you most as we head into these last few days?
For me, it's that interplay between what's happening here at home and those global events, especially the war in Gaza. I think it could really tip the scales.
You're right. It's a reminder that the world is so interconnected. What happens over there impacts us here, and the next president has to be able to navigate all of that.
It's a tall order, but a crucial one.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the U.S. election. It's been a wild ride, and it's not over yet.
Absolutely. And remember, folks, every vote counts. Stay informed, get involved, make your voice heard.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and until next time, happy analyzing.